Caleb Rourke slammed the $20 gold coin onto the wooden platforms so hard the auctioneer flinched. I said enough. The crowd went quiet. Every miner, every drifter, every cruel-eyed man in that muddy Montana street turned to look at him. And Caleb didn't move. He just stood there, 6 feet 2 inches of mountain-hardened silence, staring down a man who had been selling a human being like she was a sack of grain. The girl on the platform didn't even look up. That was the part that stayed with Caleb. Not the jeering crowd, not the auctioneer's greedy hands. It was the fact that she didn't look up, like she had already accepted whatever was going to happen to her. Like she had stopped believing it mattered. He told himself he was just stopping something wrong. He told himself any decent man would have done the same. But decent men had been standing in that crowd for the last 10 minutes, and not one of them had said a word. If you want to know what happened, if you want to know what that girl asked him in the dark of a mountain storm that broke a man who had survived everything the wilderness ever threw at him, then stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels, because stories like this one deserve to be heard all the way to the end. The auction had been going on for 11 minutes when Caleb Rourke came around the corner of Briggs Mercantile and stopped walking. He had come to town for flour lamp oil and a new blade for his draw knife. He had not come to stand in the mud on a Tuesday afternoon, watching a man in a dirty brown coat sell off a young woman like she was livestock. But there she was. She stood on a wooden platform that someone had dragged into the center of the main street. Her wrists were bound in front of her with rough rope. She wore a dress that had once been pale yellow and was now the color of dried mud and old grief. Dark hair had come loose from whatever had held it and hung across one side of her face, and she stood with her chin slightly down, her shoulders curved inward. The way a person stands when they have learned that making themselves smaller is the safest thing they can do. The man selling her was talking loud enough for the whole street to hear. Strong back, he was saying. Young, can cook, can clean, can work a full day without complaint. No family to come looking, no attachments, clean deal, no complications. Caleb stood at the edge of the crowd and listened to a human being, described like a mule at a trading post. The bidding had opened at $5 and crawled its way up to $18. There were maybe 20 men gathered, some of them miners still dusty from the shafts up on the ridge, some of them the kind of men who drifted from town to town, looking for ways to make their lives easier at someone else's expense. A few of them were laughing. A few of them were elbowing each other the way men do when they believe no one important is watching. Caleb had seen enough cruelty in his 36 years to know that crowds didn't stop it. Crowds enabled it. The only thing that stopped cruelty was a man willing to step into the space between the cruelty and its target and say simply no. He had not planned to be that man today. He had planned to get his flour and his lamp oil and be back up the mountain before dark. He pushed through the edge of the crowd. The man next to him smelled like whiskey and wet leather. "You bidding, friend?" Caleb didn't answer. The auctioneer's voice rose. 19. Do I have 19? Come on, gentlemen, this is a bargain. Young, healthy, capable, 20, said a voice from the far side of the crowd. Low, amused, the kind of voice that had money behind it and knew it. Caleb looked up. The man who had spoken was seated on a horse at the edge of the platform, which meant he hadn't even bothered to climb down. He wore a good coat. He had a deputy's badge on his chest, though the sheriff wasn't anywhere Caleb could see. He was smiling the smile of a man who had already decided the outcome of something. The girl on the platform heard his voice. She finally moved. A small, involuntary step backward, like her body knew something her face was trying not to show. Her bound hands tightened against each other. She still didn't look up. But that one step back told Caleb everything he needed to know about who that man on the horse was to her and what he wanted her for. The auctioneer grinned. $20 from Deputy Garland. Do I have 21? 21 anyone? Nobody spoke. Caleb walked to the platform. He was not a man who made noise when he moved through the world. He never had been. He came through the crowd the way a river moves through rock, not loud, not violent. Just steady, and without any intention of stopping, and when he reached the base of the platform, he pulled the $20 gold coin from his coat pocket and set it on the wooden edge, hard enough that the sound carried. The auctioneer looked down at him. 20, Caleb said. The crowd murmured. Deputy Garland turned his horse. This ain't your business, stranger. I just made it mine. Garland's jaw tightened. He was the kind of man who was used to being the largest presence in any room, and he didn't like finding someone who wasn't impressed by him. 21, he said to the auctioneer, his eyes still on Caleb. 22, Caleb said. He hadn't looked at the auctioneer. He was still looking at Garland. A few people in the crowd shifted. Not many men in that town would look at a deputy that way, even a deputy whose badge sat slightly crooked on his coat. 25, Garland said. Caleb reached into his coat pocket again, without looking away, and set another coin on the platform. 30. Someone in the crowd whistled low. The auctioneer's eyes moved back and forth between them, like he was watching a chess game he hadn't been told he was playing. Garland's face had gone the particular red of a man who has decided this is about something other than money. You don't know what you're buying yourself into, friend. I reckon that's my concern, Caleb said. For a long moment the street was almost quiet. The wind came down off the ridge cold and sharp, carrying the smell of pine and coming snow. The girl on the platform had gone very still. Then Garland made a decision. Not the right one, but the one that men like him usually make when they feel the crowd watching them. He turned his horse, slowly, like it was his own idea, like he was bored with the whole thing. She ain't worth the trouble, he said to no one in particular. And he rode. The auctioneer looked at Caleb, looked at the coins, and reached for them. Sold, he said, $30. Caleb stepped up onto the platform. The girl finally looked up. Her eyes were dark brown and very direct, which surprised him. He had expected fear, or blankness, or the particular emptiness that came from having given up. He found something else. Something watchful and careful, and still like a deer that has learned the difference between a predator approaching and something it hasn't categorized yet. He pulled out his knife. She didn't flinch. She held out her wrists. He cut the rope. She rubbed her wrists once, twice, the way you do when something has been cutting into you, for long enough to become normal, and then she looked at him. Just looked at him. My name is Caleb Rourke, he said. I live up in the Bitterroot. You're free to go wherever you need to go. She blinked. Something crossed her face that he couldn't quite name, not relief, not confusion, not gratitude. Something more complicated than any of those. Go, she repeated. That's right. She looked at the street around her. She looked at the crowd, which was already losing interest and beginning to move on the way crowds do when the spectacle is finished. She looked at the direction Deputy Garland had ridden, which was toward the sheriff's office at the end of the block. Where would I go, she asked, not desperate, not demanding. A genuine question, asked the way a woman asks when she is trying to solve a practical problem and needs accurate information to do it. Caleb hadn't thought past getting her off that platform. He stood there in the cold Montana afternoon and realized he had no good answer to give her. She watched him not answer for a moment. Then she said, I can work. I can cook. I know how to keep a cabin. I won't be a burden. I didn't buy you to have someone work for me. I know that, she said. I'm offering. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The wind pulled a strand of dark hair across her face, and she pushed it away with one hand, a gesture so ordinary in the middle of everything that it almost stopped him. It's a long ride, he said finally. Mountains get dangerous after dark this time of year. I'm not afraid of dangerous, she said. Her name, he learned when they were on the horse and moving out of town, was Eliza Harper. She was 21 years old. She told him this in the flat, factual way of someone recounting information, rather than sharing it, like she was reading from a ledger. She had been born in Missouri. Her mother had died when she was 9. Her father had remarried, and her stepmother had. She stopped there. You don't have to tell me, Caleb said. I know I don't, she said. I'm just deciding what matters. They rode in silence after that for a while. The trail climbed, the temperature dropped, the sky ahead had the heavy gray-white look of a sky carrying snow and deciding when to put it down. Eliza had both hands on the saddle horn. She was being careful not to touch him, he noticed. Even when the horse stumbled on a loose stone and she lurched sideways, she caught herself on the saddle, rather than reach for him. She was doing it deliberately, that distance. Teaching herself and teaching him at the same time, I will not presume. I will not assume. I will not take up space that hasn't been offered. It made something in his chest feel tight, in a way he didn't have a name for. Storm's coming, he said. I can see that. We need to move faster. Then move faster, she said. I won't fall. He pressed the horse into a faster walk, then a trot. She stayed in the saddle. She hadn't been lying about that, at least. The snow started 20 minutes from the cabin, the kind of snow that doesn't apologize, heavy driving, turning the trail into a white nothing almost immediately. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees in the span of an hour, and the wind had found its voice and was using it. Caleb leaned forward and pushed the horse. Behind him, Eliza didn't make a sound. No complaints, no fear. She just rode through it, which told him more about her than anything she had said. They came out of the trees into the small clearing where the cabin sat, and the horse blew out a long breath and slowed on its own. Caleb swung down and then reached up to help her. She hesitated one single second, that deliberate distance again, and then took his hand and stepped down. Her legs nearly went out from under her when she hit the ground. She grabbed the saddle with her other hand and stayed upright, but only barely. "How long since you ate?" he asked. She thought about it. Which meant long enough that she had to think about it. "Yesterday morning," she said. He didn't say anything to that. He unsaddled the horse, put him in the small lean-to shelter on the east side of the cabin, and came back for Eliza, who was still standing where he'd left her with snow covering her shoulders, because she apparently hadn't moved. "Come inside." Inside was simple. One room, stone fireplace, plank table, 2 chairs, a sleeping loft. He had what he needed, and nothing else, which was the way he preferred things. He had been alone here for 3 years. He was aware, suddenly and inconveniently, of exactly how alone that was. He built the fire up from the banked coals and hung a pot of water before she had even finished shaking the snow from her hair. She stood just inside the door and looked at the cabin the way she looked at everything, cataloging, assessing, deciding. "Sit down," he said. "You look like you're about to fall over." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You've been standing in the cold on nothing since yesterday morning." "Sit." She sat. Not because he told her to, he thought, but because she was making the practical decision that sitting was the correct response to almost falling down. She sat in the chair closest to the fire and held her hands out to the heat and said nothing. He made corn mush because it was fast and he had the ingredients. He set a bowl in front of her, and she looked at it for one moment, just one, and then ate it the way hungry people eat when they're trying not to look hungry. Which is to say, controlled and steady, right up until the point when it becomes impossible to be controlled, and then very fast. He refilled the bowl without being asked. She looked up. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I wasn't going to." A pause. "I mean another pause." Something shifted in her face. "I was going to thank you. I just didn't want you to think it meant." "It doesn't mean anything," he said, "except you were hungry and there's food." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she went back to the bowl. Outside, the storm had found its full voice. The cabin walls were thick and the fire was strong, but the wind pressed against the door and the window, and the sound of it was constant, the way loneliness was constant. A thing you stopped hearing after long enough. Not because it stopped, but because you stopped expecting anything else. Caleb sat in the other chair with his own bowl, and they ate in silence, while the storm told them both they were staying put until it was done with them. After a while she said, "The man with the badge, Garland," he said. "You know him?" "Know of him. His kind drifts through every town out here eventually." "Badge or no badge." She was quiet again. Then, "He'd been following me for 2 weeks." Caleb looked at her. "I was working at the boarding house in Millerton," she said. The woman who ran it, Mrs. Caudell, she died in October. Left the boarding house to her nephew. He arrived in November and decided he didn't want to pay wages anymore. She said this flatly, without any particular bitterness, the way you describe weather. I left. I had a little money saved. I was trying to get to Helena. Garland intercepted me on the road. She paused. He said I owed a debt to someone in town. A man named Oris. I'd never heard of Oris. But out here, owing a debt you don't know about is as good as owing a real one if the man collecting it has a badge. So he brought you to that auction. He brought me to that auction, she confirmed. Caleb set down his bowl. What about before Millerton? She looked at the fire. Before Millerton there was Garrison Creek. Before that there was a family in Wyoming who needed a governess. Before that. Let out a breath that was not quite a sigh. I've been before that, for a long time, Mr. Rourke. Caleb, he said. She looked at him. Just Caleb, he said. Mr. Rourke is what people call me when they want something, and are trying to be polite about it. Something crossed her face that might, in better light, have been the beginning of a smile. Caleb, she said, like she was trying the word out. The fire popped, the storm pressed. He stood up and took both bowls to the wash basin. And she immediately stood up to help, and he said, sit down. And she said, I'm not an invalid. And he said, I know that. You're also not going to drop from exhaustion in my cabin. And she sat back down, but she didn't look happy about it. He washed the bowls. It was a small thing. He had washed bowls alone in this cabin for 3 years. Tonight felt different, in a way he didn't look directly at. He got down the extra blanket from the loft and handed it to her. You take the bed up there. I'll sleep by the fire. She stared at the blanket in her hands. I can sleep by the fire. You need to warm up properly. The loft holds heat better. You shouldn't give up your bed for Eliza. He said her name for the first time. She stopped. I'm offering, not demanding. There's a difference. She looked at him a moment. Yes, she said quietly. There is. She climbed up to the loft. He pulled a blanket from the chest near the wall and settled into the chair and built the fire up and listened to the storm do its worst against the mountain. Sometime in the night she called down to him, Caleb. He had not been sleeping, but he had been somewhere close to it. He opened his eyes. The fire had burned down, but the cabin was still warm. Yeah. A pause. Then why did you do it? The auction. You could have kept going. He was quiet for a moment. Could have, he said. No. Another pause. Was it because you needed the help? Up here? Someone to work? No. Then why? He looked at the fire. He thought about the right way to answer that and decided that the right way was probably the true way, even if the true way was harder to say. Because you stepped back, he said, when Garland called the bid. You stepped back one step, just one, and nobody else saw it. But I did. Silence from the loft. Anybody takes one step back like that, he said. They need somebody to step forward. For a long time there was nothing from up there. Then very quietly, she said, thank you. Don't thank me yet, he said. Storm will break in a day or two and we'll figure out what comes next. All right, she said. He closed his eyes again. But before the sleep pulled him under, she spoke one more time. Her voice smaller now, careful, like she was asking a question she wasn't sure she should be asking, but needed the answer to badly enough to ask anyway. Caleb. When the storm breaks and when the food runs low, and if I can't work well enough to be worth the keeping a pause. What happens to me then? He opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling. He lay there for a long moment, in the dark of his mountain cabin, with the storm pressing its hands against every wall, and he understood fully, in that moment, the way you understand something when it reaches down past the surface of things and takes hold that the woman lying in his loft had lived so long in a world that only kept people when they were useful that she had stopped believing anything else was possible. She wasn't afraid of the snow. She was afraid of him. Not of what he might do to her, but of what he might decide she was worth. The same calculation every person in her life had eventually made. The cold arithmetic of usefulness and the moment when you stopped adding up. He thought about what to say for a long time. Then he said, "You're not livestock, Eliza. Quiet. What happens to you, he said slowly, is that you stay until you want to leave. And when you want to leave, you leave. And that's all. The wind howled against the window. The fire breathed. The snow kept falling the way Montana snow falls, thorough, committed, indifferent to what anyone preferred. From the loft, he heard nothing for a while. And then very quietly he heard something that he realized after a moment was her crying. Not loud, not desperate, just quiet, private tears, the kind that come when something you stop believing in suddenly and unexpectedly turns out to still exist, and your body doesn't know what to do with the relief of it. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. He just let her cry in the dark and kept the fire burning, and listened to the storm work itself out against the walls of his cabin. And thought about the fact that he had come down the mountain today for flour and lamp oil, and had come back with something that was going to change every quiet and empty day that came after. He didn't know yet what to call that change. He wasn't sure he needed to. The snow fell, the fire held, and up in the loft of a mountain man's cabin in the Bitterroot, a young woman who had been told her whole life that she wasn't worth keeping finally in the dark, in the storm, in the small and improbable shelter of someone else's honesty, cried herself to sleep. And in the morning, the world was white and still, and Caleb Rourke woke up with the particular feeling of a man who has made a decision he doesn't yet fully understand but knows, somewhere below all the words and reasons, was the right one. He built the fire higher and waited for whatever came next. The morning after the storm, Caleb woke to the smell of something burning. Not the cabin, not the fire, something smaller, something in the pan on the stove that shouldn't have been on the stove yet because he hadn't put it there. He sat up from the chair, stiff in every joint the way a man gets when he sleeps, sitting up past 40 degrees below freezing, and looked toward the fireplace. Eliza was standing at the stove. She had found the cornmeal. Found the pan. Found the lard tin on the shelf he kept it on, which meant she had gone through his shelves in the dark of early morning without waking him, which meant she had been up for a while, which meant she had not slept nearly as long as she should have. The cornbread she was making was starting to catch on one edge. "Pan's too hot," he said. She didn't startle, just reached over and shifted the pan off the direct heat without turning around. "I know, I fixed it." He rubbed his face, looked at the window. Gray light early, maybe an hour past dawn. The storm had broken sometime in the night and left behind the particular silence that only existed after heavy snow, a silence so complete it had texture. "You should have slept longer," he said. "I slept enough." He doubted that. He stood up, worked the stiffness out of his back, and came over to the stove. She moved one step to the side automatically, making room, not looking at him. She was wearing her same dress from yesterday, which was still slightly damp at the hem, and she had pulled her hair back with what looked like a piece of twine she'd found somewhere. "I didn't know what you usually eat in the morning," she said. "I use the cornmeal. I hope that's all right. It's fine. I can make something else if Eliza." She stopped. "It's fine," he said again, quieter. "Thank you." She nodded once, short and efficient, and went back to watching the pan. He got the coffee going, and they worked around each other in the small space without speaking, and it was strange, not uncomfortable, but strange. The way any new thing is strange when you've been alone long enough to forget what not alone feels like. He kept having the sensation of turning to say something, and then remembering there was someone actually there to say it to. They ate at the table. The cornbread was good, he told her so. She looked at the table when he said it. "Don't compliment me for doing things I'm supposed to do," she said. "Who decided what you're supposed to do?" She looked up. He held her gaze for a moment. "Seems to me you made breakfast because you wanted to. Not because you owed it. There's a difference." He picked up another piece of cornbread. "So I'll say thank you and you'll let me." She stared at him. Then she looked back at the table. But something at the corner of her mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but the suggestion that one might be possible somewhere down the road if conditions were right. They finished eating. She moved to clear the bowls immediately, and he let her because he could tell fighting her on it would make it worse, not better. She needed to do something with her hands. He understood that. He'd had 3 years of needing something to do with his hands. "How's your leg?" she asked with her back to him, washing the bowls. He'd taken a stone bruise on his left shin from the stirrup when the horse stumbled on the ice yesterday. He hadn't thought she'd noticed. "Fine," he said. "You were favoring it this morning when you stood up." "I always favor it in the cold old break." She turned around. "What happened? Rockslide, 5 years ago." She waited. "I was alone," he said. "Took me 2 days to get back to the cabin." She looked at him. The way she looked at things, categorizing direct and unhurried. 2 days on a broken leg. Not a clean one. And there was no one. She stopped herself. "I'm sorry." "That's not my business." "It's all right." He leaned back in the chair. "No, there was no one. There's been no one up here for a while." The words sat there between them, simple and honest, and he watched her absorb them. She turned back to the bowls. "I know what that's like," she said. "The kind of alone where you stop expecting anyone." "Yeah," he said. "That's the kind." She finished washing the bowls and dried her hands on the towel he kept by the basin, and then turned and stood in the middle of the cabin, looking at him with that direct, assessing look, and said, "Tell me what you need done today. I mean it actually need done, not made-up work to give me something to do. Real things." He looked at her for a moment. Then he almost laughed, not quite, but almost, which was more than he'd done in a while. "The trap lines need checking. Storm probably buried half of them." "I'll do that. Inside the log rack's getting low. I'd normally split more this morning. But..." He gestured at the window and the 4 feet of new snow visible through it. "So I'll move what's in the lean-to into the rack," she said. "That's heavy work." "I know what heavy work is," she said, not unkindly but without apology. He looked at her, this slight dark-haired woman, who had been standing on an auction block yesterday afternoon, and thought about arguing with her. Decided against it. "There's an extra pair of work gloves on the peg by the door," he said. "The leather ones, not the wool. The wool ones have a hole in the left thumb." She nodded like she was filing this information away. "All right, and Eliza," she looked at him, "don't overdo it." "I mean that practically, not..." "I know you mean it practically," she said. "I'll be sensible." She was, as it turned out, the most sensible person he had encountered in some years. By the time he came back from checking the trap lines 3 hours, 4 snowed under traps, 2 rabbits, the log rack was full, and she had also, apparently, found the broom and swept the snow that had drifted in under the door during the night. And was now sitting at the table, mending one of his shirts with a needle and thread she had found in the small sewing tin he kept in the drawer and never opened. He stood in the doorway and looked at the cabin, and then at her. "You found the sewing tin," he said. "I hope that's all right. Your shirt was torn at the shoulder. It would have caught cold air." He looked at the shirt in her hands. He'd torn it on a branch 3 weeks ago, and it had been sitting on the hook by the since then. He kept meaning to mend it, and kept not doing it. "Yeah, thank you. You're doing it again," she said. "Doing what?" "Saying thank you like it surprises you." She didn't look up from the needle. "I told you, don't thank me for things I want to do." He set the rabbits on the table and started getting the skinning knife. "So you want to mend my torn shirts?" "I want to be useful," she said. "There's a difference." He stopped, looked at her. She was still focused on the needle, pulling the thread through with the precise, practiced movements of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. "You know you don't have to be," he said. "Useful." "To stay here," she paused mid-stitch. "I told you last night," he said. "You stay till you want to leave." "I know what you told me," she resumed the stitch. "But wanting to be useful and thinking I have to be useful aren't the same thing." "I know the difference, Caleb. I'm 21, not stupid." "I know you're not stupid." "Good." She bit the thread off and examined the repair. "Then don't explain my own feelings to me." He stared at her for a moment. Then he turned back to the rabbits. "Fair enough," he said. That evening he showed her how to salt and dry the rabbit pelts. She caught on faster than he expected. her hands learning the right pressure and angle, after only 2 demonstrations, and when he commented on it she shrugged and said she'd worked a tannery in Missouri for 6 months, the winter she was 15, and it apparently stuck. A tannery, he said. How old were you when you left home? 14, she said. 15 by the time I reached Missouri. You left at 14. Left's a generous word. She kept working the pelt. My stepmother made it clear there wasn't room for me. My father didn't argue. She said this the way she said most hard things, straightforwardly, without performing the pain of it. She somehow made it worse to hear. I had a coin my mother left me, enough to get on a wagon heading east. So I went. And then, 7 years of finding work wherever I could find it. She looked up. I'm good at finding work. I'm good at making myself useful. It's about the only thing I've ever been consistently good at. Something flickered in her eyes. Until Garland decided that was a liability instead of an asset. Caleb set down the pelt he was working. He's going to come looking, he said. Garland, men like that don't let go of a thing because they lost a bid. Her hands didn't slow. I know, she said again. Quitter this time. He looked at her profile in the firelight, the straight line of her jaw, the slight tension at the corner of her eye. You're not afraid, he said. It wasn't a question. I've been afraid my whole life, she said. I'm just tired of letting it make my decisions. He didn't have anything to say to that. He picked up the pelt again. They worked in silence, and the fire burned, and outside the stars came out cold and clear over the mountain, and the night settled in around the cabin the way nights did up here, total, complete, and indifferent to whatever the people inside it were feeling. 3 days passed. Then 4. The snow held them close to the cabin, which meant they were together in ways that a woman who were effectively strangers didn't usually get to be close enough to learn habits. Close enough to see past the first layer of performed behavior into whatever was underneath. What Caleb saw underneath Eliza was not what he had expected. He had expected fragility. He found steadiness. He had expected deference. She had every reason to be deferential, given where she'd come from. He found instead a woman who disagreed with him when she thought he was wrong, who asked questions she actually wanted answers to, who laughed once, just once. On the 4th day, when he dropped an entire pot of beans because the handle was hotter than he'd anticipated, a short, surprised laugh that she immediately tried to smother, looking at him sideways, as if checking whether it was safe to have found something funny. He looked at her, looking at him, and said, "Go ahead." "It's not funny," she said. "It is a little funny." She pressed her mouth together, failed, laughed again, properly this time, and it was a good laugh, genuine, and a little rusty, like something that hadn't been used much recently. He bent down to start cleaning up the beans and found himself smiling at the floor, where she couldn't see it. On the 5th morning she came down from the loft and said, "Tell me about the rock slide." He was at the stove. "Already told you. You told me what happened." "You didn't tell me what you did." He looked over his shoulder. She was standing at the bottom of the loft ladder in her stockinged feet, arms crossed, watching him with the particular focused expression she wore when she had decided she wanted to understand something and wasn't going to be deflected. He turned back to the stove. "I tied the leg with my belt," he said. "Found a branch long enough to use as a crutch. Moved when it was light enough to see, stopped when it wasn't." "Falone," she said. "In the mountains." "I told you that part. I know." She paused. "I'm trying to understand you." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to understand?" "Why you stay up here," she said. 2 days on a broken leg because there was no one to help. Most men would have gone back down to a town after something like that. Found neighbors, community, something. The eggs in the pan needed turning. He turned them. "I had a wife," he said, 12 years ago. "We built the first version of this cabin together." He paused. "She died the 2nd winter. Fever. We were too far from town to get a doctor fast enough." He was quiet for a moment. "After that, town felt like the wrong size for me." He heard her move. Not closer, just a small shift of weight, the kind that means someone is listening with their whole body. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago. That doesn't make it smaller." He looked at the eggs. She was right about that, actually. No, he said, it doesn't. She came to the table and sat down, and he served the eggs and they ate, and somewhere in the middle of eating she said, her name? Clara. She nodded, didn't say anything else, didn't try to frame it or explain it or make it easier. Just received it his wife's name, 12 years of quiet grief, the shape of why he lived alone on a mountain and sat with it, the way a person sits, with a thing that deserves to be sat with. It was, he thought, one of the more decent things anyone had done for him in a long time. On the 6th day, Deputy Garland's man came. Caleb heard the horse before he saw anything. He was at the woodpile, and he straightened and went still the way he had learned to go still in the mountains, total, immediate, every sense focused. He heard Eliza inside the cabin stop moving. She'd heard it too. The rider came out of the trees on the east trail and pulled up about 20 yards from the cabin. He was young, maybe 25, with a rifle across his saddle, and a hardened look that was trying to be confident and landing about 6 inches short. He had a folded piece of paper in his coat pocket. Looking for a woman, he called out, name of Harper. Caleb set down the axe he'd been holding. Didn't reach for the rifle leaning against the woodpile. Just looked at the rider. Lot of ground out here, he said. Ain't seen any woman. The rider looked at the cabin. He looked at the woman-sized pair of boots sitting on the step by the door, because Eliza had left them there that morning. He looked back at Caleb. Deputy Garland has papers, he said, tapping his pocket. Says she owes a debt to a man named Orris, legal obligation. She's to be remanded to let me see those papers, Caleb said. The rider hesitated. If they're legal documents, said you show them. The rider pulled out the folded paper and held it toward him, which meant he had to walk forward. Caleb walked forward. He took the paper and unfolded it and read it. He was not a lawyer. He had not been to school past age 14. But he had been reading contracts and bills of sale and land claims for 20 years, because in the mountains, the man who can't read a document is the man who gets cheated by one. He read the paper twice, then he folded it back up and held it out. This document says Eliza Harper owes money to a man named Reuben Orris for services rendered, he said. It doesn't say what services. It doesn't have a date of agreement. It doesn't have her signature. He met the rider's eyes. In the territory of Montana, a debt document without the debtor's signature isn't worth the paper it's on. You tell Garland that. The rider took the paper. His jaw was tight. Garland ain't gonna let this sit, he said. I reckon that's Garland's problem, Caleb said. You tell him I said so. The rider looked at him for a long moment. Looked at the cabin, made whatever calculation he was going to make, and decided it came out wrong for him. He turned his horse and went back into the trees. Caleb stood in the clearing until the hoofbeats faded completely. Then he turned and walked back to the cabin and opened the door. Eliza was standing just inside, back against the wall beside the window, which meant she'd been able to see the whole exchange without being visible from outside. She had the kitchen knife in her right hand, not held like a weapon, just held, the way you hold something when you're not entirely sure what you're going to need. She looked at him. The papers were false, she said. It wasn't a question. Inconfabricated at worst. He came inside and shut the door. Either way, they won't hold. But Garland won't care whether they hold. No, Caleb said, he won't. She set the knife down on the table. Carefully, like she was giving herself a moment to think. He'll come himself next time, she said, most likely. I should go. She said it flatly, already working out the logistics in her head. He could see it in her face, the rapid calculation. I'll take the south trail. I can be at the river crossing by nightfall. There's likely a settlement somewhere. Eliza, she stopped. Where are you going, he said. In the snow, with a man on horseback and a badge and a document that says whatever he needs it to say. He kept his voice even. Where exactly are you going to go that he can't follow? She was quiet. You leave this mountain, he said. You're alone in open country with nothing behind you. You stay here. You've got walls and a man who knows this terrain better than Garland ever will. He paused. I'm not asking you to stay because I need you to. I'm asking you to stay because leaving right now is the worst option you've got. She looked at him. Her jaw was set and her eyes were bright, not with tears, just with intensity, the kind of intensity that came from thinking very fast and very hard. "Why do you care?" she said. "What happens to me either way?" "Because I'm the one who brought you up here," he said. "So what happens to you now is my responsibility." She took a breath. "Let it out. That's not a good reason." "No," he said, "it's not the only one." She looked at him for a long moment after that. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Sometimes the honest thing was knowing when to stop talking and let a person come to their own understanding. She pulled out the chair and sat down at the table. She put both hands flat on the wood in front of her. "All right," she said, "I'll stay." He nodded, went to the stove to put the kettle on. Behind him, she said, very quietly, "Caleb, yeah. The reason you brought me here. The real one. Not the one about decent men stepping forward." She paused again. "What was it?" He kept his back to her. He moved the kettle to the right spot on the stove. He thought about the honest answer and decided that she had been honest with him in ways that cost her something, and she deserved the same in return. "I saw Clara," he said, "for just a second. When you stepped back, he was quiet. 12 years and I still can't watch someone be treated as less than they are. Behind him, then I'm not her." "I know that," he said. "I know exactly who you are, Eliza. That's not what I meant." He finally turned around. "I meant that some things you don't have to understand completely to know they're right." Stepping forward was right. Everything after that. He gestured vaguely at the cabin, at her, at the kettle, at the whole complicated situation. "We're figuring it out as we go." She stared at him. Something moved in her face, something deep and complicated, and not entirely comfortable, the expression of a person who has been handed an explanation they wanted and didn't expect and aren't entirely sure what to do with. "All right," she said again. "All right," he said. The kettle started to steam. He made the coffee. That night he took first watch. He had taken to sleeping in shifts ever since the rider. Keeping one ear on the trail, and somewhere in the third hour she came down from the loft and said she'd take the second half, and he didn't argue because she was right, that he needed sleep, and wrong that she'd stay awake. But he lay in the loft listening to the soft sounds of her moving around below and found with some surprise that he slept better than he had in 3 years. On the 7th night, she told him the part she'd left out. They were at the table after supper, and it came out sideways the way the real things always do. She was talking about Millerton, about Mrs. Caudell's boarding house, about the routines of that work and the small dignities of it, and then she went quiet for a moment and said, "Garland came into the boarding house once. Before Mrs. Caudell died, he came in and looked at me, and I knew the way you know, and I went to Mrs. Caudell, and she told him to leave." She paused. She was the first person who'd ever done that for me. Caleb waited. "When she died," Eliza said, "I was still in the house when the nephew arrived, and he told me my wages were done and I needed to be out by morning. And Garland was in the street outside when I left." She stared at her hands. "I don't know if the nephew told him, or if he'd been watching the house, or if he just happened to be there. But he was there, and I ran." She looked up. "I ran for 2 weeks. And I ran out of road and ended up in Birch Falls," Caleb said. "The auction town. Ended up in Birch Falls," she said. "Trying to buy a ticket east. And Garland walked up behind me at the ticket window and said very quietly that I was coming with him or I was going to have a problem." She was steady, her voice even, but her hands on the table were pressed flat and hard. "There were people everywhere, and not one of them looked at me when he walked me out." "Eliza, I know," she said. "I know people don't look. I know how it works. I've known how it works since I was 14 years old." She took a breath. "I'm not telling you because I need you to fix it. I'm telling you because you asked me the real question last night, and I owe you the real answer." He was quiet. "The real answer," she said, "is that I have been told my whole life that no one is going to step forward. That there is no one coming. That the only person who was ever going to stand between me and what the world wanted to do to me was me." Her voice didn't waver, but something at the back of her eyes did. "And then you put a $20 coin on a platform, and looked at a man with a badge like he was nothing worth worrying about. The fire breathed. The mountain was dark and deep and full of cold. "I don't know what to do with that," she said. With someone who steps forward. "I keep waiting for the part where it costs something. Where you tell me what you actually want." "I know," he said quietly. "So tell me." Her eyes were on him, direct and a little desperate. "Because the not knowing is," she stopped, "it's harder than knowing." "Whatever it is, it's harder than knowing." Caleb looked at her. He thought about all the ways he could answer. The evasive ways. The practical ways. The ways that kept everything tidy and uncomplicated. Then he said, "I want you to still be here in the spring." She stared at him. "That's it," he said. "That's what I want. I want you to be here when the snow breaks and the trail opens up again. I want to see what you decide to do when you've got real choices in front of you. I want to know what you are when you're not running." He paused. "That's all. That's the whole thing." For a long moment she didn't move. Then she nodded once, short, decisive, the way she made decisions when she had processed something as far as it would go and come out the other side. "All right," she said. "Spring." She went back up to the loft. Caleb sat by the fire for a long time after. Outside, the mountain breathed its cold and patient breath. The pines held their snow. The stars above them burned the way stars burn in Montana, excessive, indifferent, extravagantly bright, and Caleb Rourke sat in the chair that had been his chair alone for 3 years, and listened to the quiet above him that meant Eliza Harper was sleeping, and thought about spring, and the choices a person makes when they finally have room to make them, and what it meant that he was, for the first time in a long time, curious about what tomorrow would bring. The fire burned down. He let it go. For the first time in 3 years he did not feel the silence. Spring did not arrive gently in the Bitterroot. It arrived the way most honest things arrived in Montana, without warning, without apology, and with considerably more violence than anyone had planned for. The snow began breaking in the second week of March, which meant the creek that ran 40 yards east of the cabin went from frozen silence to a roar that shook the ground in the space of 3 days. The south-facing slope turned to mud. The tree line dripped constantly. And Caleb Rourke, who had lived through 11 mountain springs alone, found himself noticing all of it differently this year, 'cause there was someone else noticing it too. Eliza had been with him for nearly 3 months. He kept track of this not because he was counting, but because the mountain kept track for him: the depth of the snow against the door, the angle of the afternoon light, the way the cold shifted from brutal to merely serious. Time passed differently when you had someone to pass it with. He had forgotten that. He was remembering it now, and the remembering was uncomfortable, in the way that things are uncomfortable when they reveal how much you've been missing without knowing it. She had changed in 3 months, not in the ways people change when they're performing recovery loudly, with demonstrations, but in the quiet ways. She slept later in the morning now, which meant she had stopped running the exhausted vigilance of someone who didn't trust their surroundings. She had opinions about how the cabin should be organized that she expressed without first checking whether he'd be offended by them. She had taken over the mending entirely, which he only realized when he noticed that everything he owned had been repaired, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd done it himself. She laughed more, not often, but more, and she had stopped flinching when he moved suddenly. He noticed the moment it stopped one morning, the 4th week of February, when he'd reached past her to grab the coffee pot and she had just moved aside, naturally, the way you move when someone needs to get by, without the fractional freeze that had preceded every near contact before. He had not said anything. He was learning what to say something about and what to leave alone. What he was less good at was what to do with the fact that he thought about her constantly. Not in ways he'd call complicated. Just the ordinary constant low hum of awareness that comes when someone has become part of the architecture of your days, wondering, when he was out on the trap lines, what she was doing, noticing, when he came back to the cabin, the way the room felt different, occupied versus empty, finding himself drawing out the evenings longer than he needed to, because the evenings were when they talked. They talked about everything and nothing, about Missouri and Montana, about the mechanics of trapping versus hunting, about whether the creek would flood its bank this spring, which he said probably not. And she said she'd want to see the evidence of that. She had a precise and slightly combative intelligence that showed itself mostly through questions. She asked questions the way a good lawyer asks them, which is to say she already had a hypothesis, and she was testing it against his answers. He liked it enormously, which was its own kind of problem. The real problem arrived on a Tuesday in late March, wearing a badge. Caleb was at the south end of the clearing, checking where the snowmelt had softened the ground around one of his fence posts, when he heard 3 horses on the east trail. Not one this time. 3. He straightened, turned. Garland came out of the trees first, and he had filled out since the auction more fed, more confident, sitting his horse the way a man sits when he's stopped worrying about opposition. Behind him were 2 men Caleb didn't recognize. One of them had a deputy's badge that matched Garland's. The other one had the flat, careful look of a man hired specifically for situations that required a flat, careful look. Garland stopped his horse 10 yards out and looked at Caleb with the expression of a man who had been planning this conversation for 3 months and was satisfied with how it opened. "Rourke," he said. "Garland," Caleb said, "you know why I'm here." "I gotta guess." Garland reached inside his coat and produced a folded document that was thicker than the one his rider had brought in January. He held it up. "Got a proper writ this time. Judge Harlan over in Millerton." Signed, dated, witnessed. He paused, letting that land. "The woman's coming with me." Caleb looked at the document. From where he was standing, he couldn't read it, which Garland knew. "Bring it over here," he said. Garland nodded to the man on his left, who rode forward and held the document down toward Caleb. Caleb took it. He read it. It was better than the last one. It had a date, it had a judge's signature, it had Eliza's name spelled correctly, which told him someone had taken time with it. It cited a debt of $47 owed to one Reuben Orris for room, board, and services over a period of 8 months. 8 months. Eliza had told him she'd been in Millerton for 14 months, working for Mrs. Caudell. Before Garland. 8 months was specific enough to be a fabrication built around a real number, the kind that was designed to look like it couldn't have been made up, because who would make up something that precise? Same man as before. Same legitimate debt, Garland said. Miss Harper worked for a woman named Caudell in Millerton. Mrs. Caudell's boarding house. She never worked for any man named Orris. She worked multiple positions, Garland said, smooth as river water. People in her situation often do. What situation is that? Garland's smile didn't reach anything above his jaw. Difficult circumstances, he said. Which is exactly why Judge Harlan's writ provides for her to work off the debt in a supervised arrangement. Comfortable arrangement, nothing. Supervised by who? Caleb said. Garland's smile held. By me, as deputy of the county. The 2 men behind him shifted their weight, not threatening, not yet just present. The flat-eyed one had his hand resting near his holster, but not on it. A message, not a move. Caleb folded the document. He was doing something behind his eyes that he'd learned to do in dangerous situations, which was to separate what was happening now from what he felt about what was happening now, because the feeling didn't help and the thinking did. The thinking told him Garland had a signed document. He had 2 men. He had the authority of a county judge whose name Caleb couldn't verify from up here. Fighting this in the clearing would solve nothing, and might solve something permanently and badly. The ground for fighting this was not a mountain clearing in mud season. The ground for fighting this was the law itself, and you didn't fight on legal ground with a rifle and a bad temper. "I'll need to get her," Caleb said. Garland's brows rose slightly. He'd expected more resistance. "Of course," he said. "Alone," Caleb said. "You'll wait here." A pause. Then Garland nodded, once magnanimous now that he'd won. "Take your time." Caleb walked to the cabin. He opened the door and stepped inside and closed it behind him. Eliza was standing in the middle of the room. She had heard the horses. She had her coat on and her boots on and the small bundle of her things which had grown to include 2 shirts he'd given her, the extra wool gloves, and a book she'd found on his shelf and quietly appropriated was tied and sitting on the table. She had been ready for this. She had known, on some level, that this was coming, and she had spent 3 months being ready for it, so that when it arrived, she wouldn't be caught in the middle of being something other than prepared. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Judge's writ," he said. I heard his voice. She said, "Garland." "Yes." She picked up the bundle. "I'll go." "You won't," he said. She stopped Caleb. "If they have legal, the document is fabricated," he said. "Partially. It's built around just enough truth to hold up if you don't know what questions to ask." He was already moving to the shelf where he kept the lockbox. "I need paper and a pen. Do we still have the pen ink?" "What, the pen ink, Eliza?" Yes." She moved to the "What are you writing?" "A letter." He found the paper. She found the ink and the pen. He sat down at the table. "The nearest federal land office is in Helena. There's also a federal circuit judge. His name is Aldous Crew. He comes through this territory every 8 months or so." He started writing. "Judge Harlan is a county judge. He can sign county writs. He cannot enforce debt collection that involves." He paused, chose his words. "There's a federal statute from 1867. Involuntary servitude. Even for debt, even with a signed document," he kept writing. "Garland knows this, which means Judge Harlan knows this. Which means this writ is legal enough to scare people who don't know the statute and useless against anyone who does." Eliza watched him write. He wrote fast, the handwriting of a man who had taught himself to write carefully enough to be readable and quickly enough to be practical. "You know federal law," she said. "I know enough of it," he said. "Clara's father was a lawyer. I spent 2 winters reading his books." He finished the letter, folded it. "I need you to stay in this cabin. Don't come out, don't speak to Garland, don't look at Garland. Whatever you hear, stay inside." She looked at him. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to tell him you're not going," he said. "And then I'm going to give him a reason not to push it." "Caleb, I need you to trust me," he said. "Not because I'm telling you to. Because I've given you 3 months of reasons to." She was quiet. She was doing the rapid, precise calculation he'd come to recognize, weighing, measuring, deciding. Then she put the bundle back down on the table. "All right," she said. "Be careful," he said. He went back outside. Garland had not moved. The 2 men behind him had not moved. Everything was in exactly the position he'd left it, which meant they were either patient or they'd had this conversation before and knew how it went. Caleb walked up to 10 feet from Garland's horse and stopped. "She's not coming," he said. The temperature of the clearing dropped by something that had nothing to do with the weather. Garland leaned forward slightly in the saddle. "That writ is county jurisdiction," Caleb said. "I know, I read it." He kept his voice even. "I also know the Peonage Act of 1867, which is federal statute and overrides any county writ involving forced labor for debt, regardless of the judge who signs it." He paused. "You ride into Helena with that document and the name Reuben Orris and a story about a woman working off a debt she never agreed to, and you'll be talking to a federal judge before the month is out." He looked at Garland steadily. "Is that what you want?" Garland's jaw moved. The flat-eyed man shifted again. The other deputy looked uncertain, the first crack in the wall of certainty Garland had ridden in with. "You're bluffing," Garland said. "I'm a man who spent 2 winters reading law books," Caleb said. "Check that against what you know about me and decide how likely I am to bluff." A long silence. The creek ran loud in the distance. A bird called somewhere in the pines. The mud under everyone's horses was soft and cold and patient. Garland straightened in the saddle. He took the folded writ back from Caleb's hand. Caleb held it out without being asked, because keeping it would look like fear, and he wasn't feeling fear. He was feeling something quieter and more dangerous than fear. "This isn't settled," Garland said. "I know that," Caleb said. "Neither is the question of who signed that document and what they were paid to do it." "That's an interesting question for a federal judge, don't you think?" Garland looked at him for a long moment. What moved across his face was not defeat. Men like Garland didn't concede defeat, they recalculated, but something shifted. Some internal arithmetic came out different than it had when he'd ridden in. He turned his horse. "You're making enemies," he said over his shoulder. "Had worse ones," Caleb said. He stood in the clearing and watched them ride back into the tree line. He stood there until the hoofbeats were gone completely, until the only sound was the creak and the wind, and the drip of snowmelt off the roof behind him. Then he went inside. Eliza was standing exactly where he'd left her. She hadn't moved an inch. Her hands were at her sides and her chin was up. And she looked exactly like a woman who had spent 20 minutes not allowing herself to be afraid, and was now specific relief of the crisis passing, about to be. "He's gone?" she asked. "For now," Caleb said. "He'll be back." With something better. She absorbed that, nodded. "What do? We write to Helena," he said tonight. "We send the letter I wrote and we get ahead of Garland with the federal circuit." He paused. "And we need evidence. About Oris. About the debt. Something that proves it's fabricated." "I have something," she said. He stopped. She went to the bundle on the table, the one she'd packed to leave with, and untied it and reached to the bottom, beneath the shirts and the gloves, and pulled out a folded piece of paper that was older and more worn than the one Garland had been waving around. She held it out. He took it, unfolded it. It was a wage receipt. From Mrs. Caudell's boarding house in Millerton. Dated 14 months ago through 10 months ago, the full period of Eliza's employment. Signed by Mrs. Caudell. It itemized wages paid, room deducted, and a final tally that showed Eliza had left Millerton with money owed to her, not owing to anyone else. Caleb stared at it. "Why didn't you show me this?" he said. "I didn't know if you'd believe me," she said, over a judge's document. "Eliza, I know," she said quietly. "I know, I've been told my word against a document was no kind of fight." She paused. "I've been told that before." He looked up at her. He thought about all the people who had told her that. About all the rooms she'd been in where her word had been weighed against a man's word, or a man's document, or a man's convenience and found insufficient. He thought about 14 months of wages earned and paid and recorded, folded up and carried like a secret, because experience had taught her that the truth was something you held in reserve. Something you didn't spend until you were sure it would count. "It counts," he said. "This will hold up in federal court against anything Garland brings." He looked at the document again. "This is the whole case, Eliza. This is everything." She looked at him carefully. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He set the document on the table. "I'm going to copy this and send both copies to Helena in the morning. One to the circuit judge's office and one to the federal land office. Garland can bring whatever he wants after that, and it won't matter." She looked at the document on the table. Then she looked at him. And then we wait," he said, "and we keep living." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long have you known enough federal law to send Garland riding home with his tail between his legs?" Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. "A while." "And you didn't think to mention that in January, when his man came with the first set of papers?" "I thought it might not come to that," he said. She looked at him with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and something warmer. "Caleb, I know," he said, "that's not the same as fixing it." "No," he said, "it's not." She shook her head, which he was coming to recognize as her version of deciding not to pursue an argument she'd already won. She picked up the bundle and put her things back away. He watched her do it, watched her put the extra shirt back on the peg, put the gloves back on the shelf, put the book back on the table where she'd left it, watched her unpack for the cabin in the way that meant she was staying, and felt something in his chest do something he wasn't entirely prepared for. That night the temperature dropped again, the way it did in the mountains even after you thought winter was done, a reminder that the season was leaving on its own schedule, and not yours. They sat by the fire after supper, and he read the letter he'd drafted out loud, and she listened and stopped to suggest different wording, and both times her wording was better than his. "Where'd you learn to write like that?" he asked. "Mrs. Caudell," she said. "She taught me." She said a woman who couldn't write a clear letter was a woman who couldn't protect herself. She paused. She was right. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was the first person who taught me something because she thought I was worth teaching. Eliza looked at the fire. I think about her a lot, what she would say about all of this. She glanced at him sideways. She would probably like you. She had no patience for men who talked too much. He looked at her. I don't talk too much. No, she said. You really don't. And there was something in the way she said it quiet. Slightly wondering that made him understand. She didn't mean it as a simple compliment, but as the observation of someone who had spent a long time around, people who filled silence with noise and had found, unexpectedly, one who didn't. He looked back at the fire. The thing in his chest that had moved when she unpacked was moving again, steadily, and he was running out of ways to classify it as something other than what it was. The letter went out the next morning with the trapper, who came through every 3 weeks carrying mail to and from the valley. He was a wiry, sun-leathered man named Pete who had known Caleb for a decade and looked at Eliza with undisguised curiosity, and then at Caleb with the expression of a man who has just understood something and is too wise to say it. Anything I should know? Pete asked, when Eliza went inside to get the second copy of the document. No, Caleb said. Pete looked at the cabin door, looked at Caleb. All right, he said, in the tone of a man who meant the opposite. The response came back 3 weeks later. Caleb was out on the South Ridge when it came. He came home to find Eliza sitting at the table with 2 envelopes open in front of her and an expression on her face that he had learned to read by now, that particular stillness that meant something large had happened. And she was processing it before she let it move her. She looked up when he came in. The circuit judge, she said. His name is Aldous Crew. I know, I wrote to him. He's coming to Millerton, she said, 3 weeks from Wednesday. He wants the original wage document and any other evidence regarding the fabricated debt. She paused. He also wrote to the sheriff in Birch Falls about the auction. Caleb stood still. The auction, he says what Garland did, she said carefully, may constitute a violation of federal law. Multiple violations. She looked at the letter. He used the word criminal. Eliza, Caleb said. I know, she said. I know. She looked up. I didn't think it would. She stopped. Pressed her mouth together. Started again. I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life running from something like Garland. I thought that was just the shape of things. For someone like me. Someone like you, he said. Someone with no family and no money and no... She stopped again. Someone who doesn't have people to stand for them. He crossed the room and sat down in the chair across from her, the way he'd been sitting across from for 3 months at this table, where they'd eaten and talked and argued about the right wording for letters. He put his hands flat on the table. You have people, he said. She looked at him. You have Pete, she said, who rode that letter to Helena in the worst mud this creek has put out in 5 years. You have Judge Crew, who is apparently a man who takes the law seriously enough to write back in 3 weeks. You have me. He paused. That's people, Eliza. She looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were very bright, not crying, just at the edge of it, hovering in that place where the feeling was so large it had nowhere to go yet. You didn't have to do any of this, she said. I know. You could have let him take me. You could have let him come back with the better writ and told yourself you'd done what you could. I know that too. Because that's not what you do, he said. It came out simpler than he'd planned, simpler and more final. When someone is yours to stand for, you stand for them. That's all, there's no calculation in it. She was very still. When someone is yours, she repeated. He met her eyes. The fire popped. Outside, the creek ran high and fast over its banks, right where Eliza had predicted it would, and the world was mud and melt, and the messy, violent business of one season becoming another. And across the table from him was a woman who had been sold on a platform for $20, and had, in 3 months, quietly and without fanfare, become the most essential person in his world. He had known it for a while. He was done pretending otherwise. Yes, he said, if you'll have it that way. She looked at him. The brightness in her eyes sharpened into something that was more decided than uncertain. I've been deciding things for myself for 7 years, she said. Every bad decision I ever made was when I let someone else decide for me. I know, he said. I'm not deciding anything. I'm telling you how it is for me. What you do with that is yours. A long silence, the creak. The fire, the slow, heavy drip of the eaves. I'll have it that way, she said. No one moved, no one needed to. Outside, something shifted in the mountain. Not dramatically, not loudly. Just the sound of snow settling somewhere far up the ridge, a deep, slow exhale, the sound of something that had been holding on a long time finally letting go. Caleb looked at Eliza across the table. She looked back. And then quietly, privately, with no audience but the fire and the mountain, she smiled. Not the half-smile he'd been working with for 3 months. The real one, the one that took her whole face and changed it entirely. He thought he had not seen anything so good in a very long time. 3 weeks to Millerton, then, she said. Brisk now, practical, picking up the letter again. We'll need to bring the original document. And you'll need to write down everything you know about Garland's timeline from the auction forward. We can start tonight, he said. Good. She smoothed the letter on the table. Then, without looking up, as if it were a perfectly ordinary thing to say, at the end of a perfectly ordinary evening. Thank you, Caleb. You're doing it again, he said. She looked up. Thanking me for things you don't owe me a thank you for. She considered this. This one I do, she said. He looked at her. All right, he said. This one you do. The fire burned. The creek ran. 3 weeks to Millerton. And everything waiting to be said in a courtroom that had been said first in the quiet of a mountain cabin by 2 people who had each been alone for too long and had, against every reasonable expectation, found each other on the other side of a $20 coin on a wooden platform. He pulled out paper and the ink. She read the letter again, already marking what they'd need. And the mountain held them both, patient and enormous and indifferent, the way it held everything, the way it had held Caleb alone for 3 years, and was now, without any fanfare or ceremony, holding something else entirely. The ride to Millerton took 2 days. Caleb had made the trip a dozen times over the years for supplies, for mail, for the occasional piece of business that couldn't be handled from the mountain. And he had always made it alone, which meant he had always made it fast and without conversation. 2 days of trail and cold camp, and the particular silence of a man who had nowhere to be except where he was going. This time was different. Eliza rode beside him on the spare horse, a gray mare named Sutton that he'd acquired from Pete 2 winters ago in trade for 3 beaver pelts and a month of bad feeling about whether he'd gotten the better end of the deal. Sutton had opinions about the pace and expressed them regularly, and Eliza handled her with the calm, no-argument firmness of someone who had dealt with more difficult temperaments than a horse and knew that patience was faster than force. He watched her handle Sutton on the first morning and didn't say anything about it, but something settled in him, the last piece of an assessment he had been making for 4 months without fully admitting he was making it. She was competent. Not in the showy way of someone performing competence to be seen, but in the deep, unremarkable way of someone who had needed to be able to do things and had therefore learned to do them. He found it not, for the first time, quietly extraordinary. They talked on the trail the way they talked in the cabin, which was to say in the spaces between comfortable silences, moving in and out of conversation, the way you move in and out of rooms you know well. Tell me about Judge Crew, she said on the first afternoon. I don't know much. Pete knows him, says he's a serious man. Doesn't like theatrics. Good, she said. I have evidence. We have evidence, he said. She glanced at him sideways. You've been saying that. We. That's what it is, he said. She looked forward again. I'm not used to that. I know, he said. You'll get used to it. She didn't answer, but Sutton chose that moment to throw a small tantrum about a muddy section of trail, and Eliza brought her back without breaking a sweat. And by the time the horse was settled again, the moment had passed the way moments do, when neither person is ready to stay in them yet. They camped the first night in a hollow he knew, where the rock broke the wind, and there was a spring close enough to water the horses without a long walk. He built the fire, and she laid out the bedrolls, and they ate cold biscuits, and the last of the hard cheese she'd wrapped and packed that morning before they left, and the night came down around them big and clear and full of stars. I've been thinking about what happens after, she said. She was looking at the fire. After Millerton, after the hearing, after Garland. She paused. After all of it, he waited. I don't know what I'm going to do, she said, with how things are. I've always known what I was doing, because I had to know. There was always a next thing, a next town, a next job, a next reason to keep moving. She looked up. I don't have that now. Is that a problem? He asked. I don't know yet, she said honestly. It feels strange. Like standing in a room with no walls. She paused. I think most people would call that freedom. I'm still deciding if that's what it feels like. He looked at the fire. Freedom takes some getting used to, he said. When you've spent a long time without it. She looked at him. Is that what it was like, after Clara? He thought about that. Different, he said. After Clara it was more like walking into a room you've always known and finding it empty. And deciding that empty was easier than try to fill it again. He paused. That's not freedom. That's just giving up and calling it a choice. She was quiet for a moment. When did you stop calling it a choice? He looked at her. 4 months ago, he said, December. Tuesday. She held his gaze. He watched her understand the specific arithmetic of what he'd just said, that he meant her, meant the day of the auction. Meant that the $20 coin on the platform had not been a charitable impulse or a moral reflex, but something that had rearranged him at a deeper level than he'd admitted at the time. She looked back at the fire. That's a very precise answer. I'm a precise man, he said. She pressed her lips together in the way that meant she was preventing herself from smiling about something. He had become very fluent in what her face did when it was preventing itself from doing things. They slept. He took first watch and she argued about it, and he let her argue and then did it anyway, and when he woke her at midnight she took over without complaint, which was as close as she ever got to conceding a point. Millerton in late April was a different town than the one he'd ridden through in December. Bouger, louder, the particular noise of a mining town in the warm months, when there was money moving and men to spend it. They came in on the North Road just after noon, and looked up at them, the way small towns look at strangers with that brief total assessment that takes in horse quality and saddle condition and the set of a person's shoulders and draws conclusions. Eliza rode straight. He noticed her do it, the deliberate squaring of her spine, as they came into the main street, the chin that lifted by a fraction of an inch. Not performance, preparation. The physical act of reminding herself who she was before anyone in this town tried to tell her. He pulled up in front of the hotel, which was also where Pete had told him the circuit court set up, when crew came through. The hotel keeper was a woman in her 50s with iron gray hair and the expression of someone who had seen everything twice. She looked at Caleb, looked at Eliza, and said, 2 rooms or 1? 2, Caleb said, at the same time that Eliza said 2, and the hotel keeper took their money without comment. The hearing was set for the following morning at 9. They had the afternoon. Eliza wanted to walk the town. He went with her not because she needed him to, but because she didn't tell him not to. She was quiet as they walked, not the watchful quiet of the early weeks, but a thinking quiet. She was working something out, processing, running calculations that weren't quite ready to come out as words yet. He waited. He had gotten good at waiting. Then they turned a corner and both stopped. Deputy Garland was standing in front of the sheriff's office, 30 yards ahead. He had not seen them yet. He was talking to another man, someone Caleb didn't recognize, heavy-set, well-dressed for Millerton, the kind of well-dressed that came from new money, and wanted to be noticed. Eliza's hand found his arm, not grabbing, just contact, one brief point of contact, and then she let go. That man with him, she said very quietly, the heavy one. Who is he? That's Reuben Orris, she said. Everything in Caleb went very still. Orris, the man whose name was on the fabricated debt document. The man who supposedly existed only as a name on a piece of paper. Standing 30 yards away, having a comfortable conversation with the deputy, who had put Eliza on an auction platform. You know him, Caleb said. I've seen him, she said. He used to come to Mrs. Caudell's boarding house. Before she died, he never stayed, he'd just come, Look around, sometimes speak to Mrs. Caudell in private. She paused. I never knew what they talked about. She didn't like him. I could tell that much. What does he do? His business? I don't know exactly. Property. She paused. He owns a lot of property around Millerton. They stepped back around the corner before Garland could turn and see them. Caleb stood with his back to the wall and thought fast. He's here for the hearing, he said. Yes, she said. Which means Garland told him we'd written to Crew. Which means someone at the federal office in Helena is talking to people they shouldn't be talking to. Eliza's jaw was set, or Garland has someone watching the mail route. He looked at her. You said that like you've considered it before. I considered a lot of things, she said, in the 2 weeks between sending the letter and getting a response. I thought about all the ways it could go wrong. She met his eyes. I just didn't think Oris would be standing in the street. It changes things, he said. How? It means this isn't just Garland overstepping, he said slowly. Oris being here means there's money behind this. Real money with real interests. The fabricated debt, the auction, the writ from Harlan, someone paid for all of that. Garland isn't smart enough to build this alone. He looked around the corner and back. Oris wanted you specifically. Why? She was quiet for a moment. Then, Mrs. Caudell's boarding house had 3 rooms that she rented to minors long term. They paid monthly. She kept the books herself. Eliza paused. When she died, the nephew, his name was Aldous Caudell, he came to close the estate. He couldn't find the ledger books. They'd gone missing. Caleb looked at her. I had them, she said. She gave them to me the week before she died. She was sick and she knew it, and she handed me the ledger book, said, You keep these. You're the only person in this town. I trust not to burn them. Eliza looked at him steadily. I didn't know why then. I thought she meant for the estate. But, he said, but 3 of the long-term renters were minors working a claim that Oris had been trying to buy, she said. I went through those ledgers when I was running, in the 2 weeks before Garland caught up with me. She paused. There are entries in Mrs. Caudell's handwriting. Payments she received on behalf of the minors. Money that Oris paid her specifically to keep those minors in place, in those rooms, working that claim, while he arranged the paperwork to seize it. She paused. She wrote it all down, dates, amounts, who came to pay. She was documenting it. I think she was going to go to someone official with it, and then she died before she could. The world was very quiet for a moment. Where are the ledgers? Caleb said. In my bundle, she said. He stared at her. I've been carrying them for 6 months, she said. I didn't know what they meant at first. And then when I understood, she looked at him. I didn't know who to trust with them. I didn't know if I told someone and they turned out to be Oris's man, it would make everything worse. She met his eyes. I was waiting for the right person. The right person. He didn't say anything about that. He didn't need to. We take them to Crew tonight, he said, before the hearing. We ask for a private meeting. Crew doesn't know us from... He knows our letter, Caleb said, and he knows the wage document. And when we put the ledgers in front of him, he'll know what he's dealing with. He looked at her directly. Eliza, what's in those ledgers is bigger than a fabricated debt and an illegal auction. This is land fraud, federal land fraud. That's a different kind of hearing entirely. She absorbed this. Her face was very controlled, but her eyes were doing the thing they did when something was happening faster than she'd planned for. Garland and Oris in the street, she said. They came here thinking this was going to go one way. Yes, he said, and we're about to show them it's going another. That's the idea, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, if this goes wrong, it's not going to go wrong, he said. But if it does, Eliza, she looked at him. I didn't bring you 4 months through a Montana winter and 2 days of bad trail to let it go wrong now, he said. I'm not built that way. She looked at him for a long moment, that direct, unhurried look that saw things clearly and called them what they were. Then she nodded, decided. Go get the ledgers, he said. I'll find out where Crew is staying. Judge Aldous Crew was a tall, thin man in his 60s with the careful of someone who had spent 40 years watching people try to deceive him and had developed a comprehensive immunity to it. He received them in the small back room of the hotel that served as his office when he was in Millerton, and he looked at Caleb and Eliza with the same expression he probably used on everyone: thorough, skeptical, and ultimately fair. He looked at the wage document first. He read it twice. He set it down and said, "And the fabricated debt document." "We don't have Garland's copy," Caleb said, "but I can reproduce its contents accurately." I read it twice. "Do that," Crew said, and pushed a piece of paper across the desk. Crew read. Then Eliza put the ledgers on the desk. Crew looked at them. He looked at her. "What are these?" "Booking ledgers from Mrs. Adelaide Caudell's boarding house in Millerton," Eliza said. "Given to me by Mrs. Caudell 1 week before her death. They document payments made by Reuben Orris to Mrs. Caudell in exchange for housing and maintaining 3 miners working the Kettle Creek claim from 1872 through 1873. The same claim Orris subsequently filed to acquire through adverse possession after those miners who were current in their rent, as documented here, were alleged to have abandoned it." Crew was very still. He opened the ledger. He looked at the first page. Then the second. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at Eliza Harper with the expression of a man who has just had the ground shift under him and is deciding how to find his footing. "How long have you had these?" he asked. 6 months, she said. "And you're bringing them to me now because Reuben Orris is standing in the street outside your hotel," she said. "Having a conversation with the deputy who sold me at an auction in December and has been trying to force me back into his custody with fabricated debt documents ever since." She paused. "I expect Orris wants the ledgers. I expect that's what this whole thing has been about." Not the debt at all." Crew looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb. "You're the man who bought her at the auction." "I am," Caleb said. "And your interest in this matter?" "She's under my protection," he said simply. Crew looked between them. Made no comment about this. Turned back to the ledgers. He read for 40 minutes. They waited. The hotel sounds moved around them: footsteps, voices, the clatter from the kitchen below, and Crew read in the careful, total way of a man for whom documents were the primary language of the world. Finally, he closed the ledger. He set it on top of the wage record. He looked at Eliza. "Miss Harper," he said, "I'm going to need you to testify to the provenance of these documents tomorrow. Everything you've told me in open court, with Orris and Garland present." "I know," she said. "That's not a small thing to ask." "No," she said, "it's not. They will have counsel. They will question you, I know." He looked at her steadily. "Are you prepared for that?" She met his eyes without blinking. "Judge Crew," she said, "I have been preparing for that since I read the Orris ledger books in a room above a livery stable in Garrison Creek while I was running for my life." She paused. "Yes, I'm." Crew nodded, a single slow nod that meant he believed her. He looked at Caleb. "Mr. Rourke, I'll need your account of the auction. And your assessment of the documents you reviewed." "Whatever you need," Caleb said. "Be here at 8:30, Crew said. "Before the hearing opens, before Orris's counsel gets in the room." He looked at both of them. "And don't speak to Garland or Orris between now and then. If they approach you, you have nothing to say." "Understood," Caleb said. They walked back to the hotel in the early evening, the light going golden the way it does in April, when the days are finally starting to remember themselves. Eliza was quiet beside him, not the thinking quiet of earlier. Something else, something that had weight to it. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Strange," she said. "Like something I've been carrying for a long time is about to be set down and I can't remember what it felt like to not carry it." He understood that exactly. "You did it," he said. "The ledgers. That was you. You carried those for 6 months through everything and brought them to the right person at the right moment." "We brought them," she said. "I didn't know they existed until this afternoon." "No," she said, "but you built the thing that made it safe to tell you." She looked at him sideways. "That counts, Caleb. That counts the same. He didn't know what to say to that. He said nothing and let it stand. They had supper in the hotel dining room, and Garland came in while they were eating and stopped when he saw them and looked at them with the expression of a man who has realized mid-step that the terrain has changed under his feet. He recovered fast, men, like Garland always recovered fast, and chose a table on the far side of the room and sat with his back to them. Which Caleb noted was the action of a man who didn't like what he'd seen in their faces and didn't want to look at it again. He knows something's wrong, Eliza said quietly. Let him wonder, Caleb said. She looked at her plate. Then she picked up her fork and ate, and the steadiness of it, the simple, defiant normality of eating supper in the same room as the man who had sold her, without flinching, without hurrying, made him proud of her, in a way he couldn't have articulated, but felt completely. After supper in the hallway outside her room, she stopped and turned to face him. I need to ask you something, she said. Ask it. After tomorrow. She looked at him directly. Whatever happens, if it goes our way, if Crew does what we think he might do after all of that is settled. She paused. What do you actually want? Not what you're willing to do. What you want. He looked at her. The hallway was lit by a single oil lamp on the wall, and the light was soft and warm, and her face in it was, he didn't have enough language for her face. He had never been a man with enough language for the things that mattered most. I want to go home, he said, to the cabin. I want to go home and have you with me. He paused. Not as a debt, not as a transaction. Because you want to be there and I want you there, and that's the whole of it. She held his gaze. I keep waiting, she said, for the version of this where it costs me something. Where you tell me what I owe for all of it. You don't owe me anything, he said. You never did. I know that's what you think, she said. I'm getting better at believing it. She looked at him. I'm going to keep getting better at it. I want you to know that. I know, he said. She was quiet. Then she reached up a small deliberate movement, decided, and put her hand against his jaw. Just that, just her hand against his face, warm and still. He went absolutely motionless, the way you go motionless, when something you did not let yourself expect is happening, and you don't want to do the wrong thing by moving wrong. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood on her toes and pressed her mouth to his cheek, brief and certain, and stepped back. Good night, Caleb, she said. Good night, he said. She went inside. He stood in the hallway for a moment longer than he needed to, and then walked to his own room, and lay in the dark on the unfamiliar mattress and looked at the ceiling and thought about everything and nothing, and the particular warmth of someone's hand against your face when you had not been touched gently in a very long time. He slept better than he had any right to. At 8:30 they were in Crew's office. By 9 they were in the small courtroom the hotel's largest meeting room became when Crew's clerk laid out the chairs and the table and the ledge that served as a bench. By 9:15 Oris's lawyer, a narrow man from Helena named Fisk, was questioning the provenance of the ledgers with the focused energy of someone being paid well to create doubt. Eliza answered every question. She was, Caleb discovered, extraordinary in a courtroom. She was not emotional, she was not uncertain. She had the date, the time, the specific words Mrs. Caudell had used when she handed her the books, the state of Mrs. Caudell's health, the exact sequence of events from that afternoon to this one. When Fisk tried to suggest she might have altered the entries, she said, simply and without heat, the ink in those entries is 18 months old. The ink in the entries I could have made is 4 months old. Judge Crew can have both examined if he chooses. When Fisk tried to suggest her employment at the boarding house was itself disputed, she laid the wage document on the table and said, there it is. 14 months, signed and dated. Garland sat at the respondent's table and said nothing. He had the particular silence of a man who is watching something collapse and has realized that anything he says will only accelerate it. Oris's face across the room moved through several stages. Confidence became unease, became something harder, something calculating, the face of a man who is not yet defeated but is already deciding how to retreat. Then Crew called Caleb. He testified for 20 minutes. He was factual, brief, and specific. He described the auction. He described the first writ, the second writ, the Peonage Act. He described the rider who came to the cabin, and Garland's visit with two men, and the way the fabricated debt document had been constructed specifically to look legitimate to someone who didn't know the relevant federal statute. When Fisk rose to question him, he asked, "Mr. Rourke, isn't it true that you purchased Miss Harper at auction? That she was at that moment effectively your property under the terms of the transaction?" The room went very still. Caleb looked at Fisk. He looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "No person is property under any terms of any transaction. The transaction at that auction was illegal. I disrupted it by outbidding the man conducting it, and the moment that woman stepped off that platform, she was free. That's all that transaction ever was." Fisk opened his mouth. "You have another question," Caleb said. Fisk closed his mouth. He sat down. Crew wrote something. He looked at Oris. He looked at Garland. He looked at the ledgers and the wage document laid out in front of him, with the particular expression of a man who did a great many things in 40 years on the circuit, and has just seen something that belongs in a separate category. "I'm going to recess until 2 o'clock, he said. "Mr. Fisk, your client should spend that time considering his options very carefully. Deputy Garland, you'll surrender your badge to the county sheriff before this hearing reconvenes." He paused. "That's not a request." Garland's face went flat. "Court's recessed," Crew said. Outside in the hall, in the sudden, slightly stunned quiet after the room emptied around them, Eliza stood with her hands at her sides and looked at the wall and then at Caleb. He said, "Surrender the badge," she said. "Yes," Caleb said. "Before the recess, before the ruling." Yes, she looked at him. That means Crew made up his mind about Garland somewhere in the last 3 hours, Caleb said. "The rest is paperwork." She looked at the door of the courtroom. She looked at Caleb. Something moved across her face it was the thing he had only seen once before, that night in the cabin when she'd cried in the dark relief, so total it almost looked like grief, because they were the same size sometimes, relief and grief. When the thing you'd been bracing against for so long finally stops. "It's over," she said. "The worst of it," he said. "Yes." She looked at him. Her eyes were bright. "I want to go home," she said. "After 2 o'clock. After Crew's ruling. I want to go back to the mountain." "Home," she said. He had been thinking of it as his cabin. She was calling it home. "We'll leave as soon as it's done," he said. She nodded. And then right there, in the hallway of the Millerton Hotel, with Oris's lawyer 30 feet away and a county sheriff's deputy watching from the end of the hall, she stepped forward and put her arms around him. Not romantic, not performed. Just her, pressing her forehead against his shoulder, her arms around his ribs, holding on the way you hold on when something is finally over and your body doesn't know yet what to do with, the absence of the weight. He put his arms around her. He held her for as long as she needed. When she stepped back, her eyes were dry. She straightened her coat. She pushed her hair back. She looked, he thought, like someone who had just set down something very heavy and was taking her first breath without it. 2 o'clock, she said. 2 o'clock, he said. Crew's ruling took 45 minutes to read into the record and covered more ground than either of them had anticipated. The fabricated debt was voided in its entirety. The ledger evidence was formally entered into federal record, with a referral to the territorial prosecutor regarding the Kettle Creek land claim and Oris's role in its fraudulent acquisition. Garland was stripped of his deputy status and referred for criminal prosecution under 2 separate federal statutes. Oris sat through all of it, with the stillness of a man who is already calculating his next move, but the tightness around Fisk's eyes said clearly that the next move was going to be harder than anything that had come before. And in the last paragraph, Crew looked up from his notes and said, directly to Eliza, "Miss Harper, the court finds no legal obligation, debt, or claim of any kind against you. You are fully and completely at liberty. These proceedings make that permanent record." Eliza said, "Thank you, Judge." Her voice was steady. Her hands at her sides were shaking. Only Caleb was close enough to see it. They were on the North Road out of Millerton by 4 o'clock. The horses moved at a good pace, and the afternoon light was long and gold, and the mountains ahead of them were blue dark against the sky. enormous and patient and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened in a hotel courtroom in a small town at their feet. Eliza rode beside him. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Caleb, yeah, I want to tell you something." "Go ahead." She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. "In January," she said. "That first night. When you told me you'd keep me till I wanted to leave." She paused. "I thought you were lying. Or that you meant it then and would change your mind when I wasn't useful enough or when it got inconvenient." She paused again. "I spent the first month waiting for you to change your mind." He listened. "I spent the second month trying to make myself so useful that you wouldn't have a reason to," she said. "And I spent the third month realizing that you weren't waiting for a reason. That you didn't need one." "That's right," he said. "And then this month," she paused. "This month I spent trying to figure out what it meant that I didn't want to leave." He looked at her profile. "I've made decisions all my life," she said, "because I had to make them. Because something was chasing me, or I was running low on money, or there was a better job somewhere else. I've never made a decision just because I wanted something." She looked at him. "So I want to be clear. What I'm saying now, I'm saying it because I want to. Not because I need to. Not because you've done something I owe you for. Not because there's nowhere else to go." She met his eyes on the trail. "I want to be there, in that cabin, with you. That's what I want." He held her gaze for a long moment. The horses walked. The light shifted. The mountain ahead of them rose up enormous and dark and steady. "Then that's where you'll be," he said. She looked forward again. She let out a slow breath. Something in her posture changed, not slumping, not collapsing, just releasing. The last of the held-in readiness, the last of the brace against disaster, coming out of her in one long, quiet exhale as the north road carried them toward the mountains, and the mountains held their ground the way they always had, big and cold in there. He reached across the space between the horses and held out his hand. She looked at it. Then she reached across and took it. They rode north as the sky behind them went from gold to amber to the deep layered blue of oncoming dark, and ahead of them the Bitterroot rose up against the stars. And somewhere in those mountains was a one-room cabin with a fire that needed building and a log rack that needed filling and a morning that would come ordinary and real and entirely theirs. His hand was warm, hers was warmer, neither of them let go. They came back to the mountain on the second evening, riding the last hour in the dark the way people ride, when they know the trail well enough not to need the light. The cabin was cold. It had been empty for 3 days, and the mountain had taken back every degree they'd left in it, pressing in through the walls and the floor the way cold does when it has time and patience and no one arguing against it. Caleb went straight to the fireplace and worked the flint while Eliza saw to the horses, and by the time she came back inside, stomping mud from her boots at the door, the fire had found its feet and was beginning to mean something. She stood in the middle of the cabin and looked around at all of it, the shelf with the coffee tin, the sewing basket she'd moved 3 inches to the left 4 months ago, and he'd never moved back. The book on the table that was hers now, in the way things become yours when you've handled them enough, and she let out a breath that was long and slow, and contained approximately 4 months of tension and 3 days of courtrooms. "Home," she said. "Just said it." He looked up from the fire. "Yeah," he said. She hung her coat on the peg, the left peg, which had become her peg without either of them the subide rig, and came to the fire and held her hands out to it. He moved to give her room, and she stepped into the space he made, close enough that he could feel the cold still coming off her coat. "I keep thinking about Crew's face," she said, when he read the ruling. "Which part?" "The part about Garland. When he said surrender the badge." She looked at the fire. "He said it like it was nothing, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world." She paused. "I've been afraid of men like Garland my whole life. And Crew just said it, like he was talking about the weather." "That's what the law is supposed to do," Caleb said. "When it works. It doesn't always work," she said. "No," he said, "it doesn't, but sometimes it does. And when it does, it's because someone put the document in front of the right person at the right time." He looked at her. "That was you." She was quiet. "Mrs. Codell gave you those ledgers," he said. And you carried them for 6 months when you had no reason to think they'd ever matter. You brought them to Helena and you testified for them in open court with Oris, sitting 10 feet away. He paused. That's not luck, that's you. She looked at the fire for a long moment. She would have liked today, she said, Mrs. Caudell. She would have liked all of it. Something moved in her face. She tried to do it herself and she ran out of time. And I finished it for her. She pressed her lips together briefly. I didn't know that's what I was doing until I was doing it. Sometimes that's the only way it happens, he said. She nodded. Then she said quietly, I want to go back to Millerton. When things are settled, I want to put flowers on her grave. We will, he said, no hesitation. She looked at him. At the we. I'm going to keep doing that, he said. Saying we, I want you to know that. Something shifted in her face. I know, she said. I'm getting used to it. She was not fully used to it yet. He knew this. He also knew she was getting there, moving toward it, the way she moved toward most things, steadily and without fanfare, the way you move when you've decided on a direction and trust your own feet. He made coffee because it was late and they were cold. And because the ritual of making coffee in this cabin had become one of the anchors of his days, something ordinary that meant everything was in its right place. She sat at the table and watched him move around the kitchen, with the familiarity of someone watching something they know well and find comfort in. And he was aware of her watching and found, as he had been finding for months, that being seen by her was different from being seen by anyone else. She had a way of looking at him that took him in without making demands of what she found. He set the coffee down and sat across from her. She wrapped both hands around the cup. Looked at it. Then she looked up. I want to ask you something, she said. And I want you to answer it straight. I always answer you straight, he said. I know, she said. That's why I'm asking, she paused. The coin. He looked at her. The $20 gold coin, she said. The one you put on the platform. She reached into the pocket of her skirt and set it on the table between them. It sat there in the firelight, a small round piece of metal that had done more work than any coin had a right to do. He stared at it. Where did you get that? The auctioneer dropped it, she said. When Garland left, and you were getting your horse. It fell in the mud by the platform. I picked it up. She looked at him steadily. I've had it since December. He looked at the coin. He looked at her. Why? Because I needed something that was mine, she said. Not a wage receipt or a ledger book or evidence for a courtroom. Something that was just mine that I'd decided about. She paused. And because I didn't know yet what I wanted to do with it. I wanted to wait until I did. He waited. I know what I want to do with it now, she said. She slid it across the table toward him. He looked at it. Didn't touch it. Eliza, I'm not giving it back, she said. That's not what this is. I'm not paying you back, and I'm not settling a debt because there isn't one. She held his gaze. I'm giving it to you because I want you to have it. Because that coin is the reason I'm here. The reason She stopped. Took a breath, started again. The reason I know what home feels like again. And I want you to keep it, not as a reminder of what you paid. As a reminder of what it bought. His hand moved to the coin. He picked it up. It was warm from her pocket, small and solid and $20, and the entire weight of everything that had happened since December, compressed into the size of a man's thumbnail. He looked at her. What did it buy, he said. Quiet. She met his eyes without any hesitation at all. It bought me a man who stepped forward, she said. When nobody else did. When I had stopped expecting anyone to. She paused. That's worth more than I can calculate. And I've been calculating things my whole life. The fire breathed. Outside, the mountain did what it always did, breathed and held and bore everything up, enormous and patient and careless of the small lives lived at its feet. Caleb closed his hand around the coin. All right, he said. I'll keep it, she nodded once. Then she picked up her coffee and drank it, and he did the same, and they sat in the warmth of the cabin they had come back to together, and let the silence be the thing it had become, not empty, not lonely, but full of all the things that didn't need to be said, because they were already known. The weeks that followed were ordinary in ways that felt extraordinary, only if you understood what ordinary meant for each of them. For Caleb, ordinary had meant silence and repetition, and the management of days that were identical in their structure, because structure was how you survived alone. Ordinary now meant 2 cups at the table instead of 1. Ordinary meant finding the sewing basket moved and the shelf reorganized and a book left open on the chair he usually sat in, and having to choose a different chair and not minding. Ordinary meant a voice in the room when he came home from the trap lines. Ordinary meant laughing not often, but enough, always at something specific, always real. For Eliza, ordinary had meant vigilance. It had meant the constant low hum of assessment. Is this safe? Can I trust this? What does this cost me that a person develops when their safety has never been guaranteed? Ordinary now meant waking without that hum, not all at once, and not without backsliding on certain mornings when a loud noise from outside would put her back against the wall with her heart going fast before she remembered where she was. But more and more, ordinary meant the specific piece of a place that was hers in a way that nothing had ever been hers. A peg for her coat, a side of the table, a mare named Sutton who was unreasonable with everyone except her. Pete came through in May with mail and supplies and took one long, satisfied look at the state of things and said nothing, which was the loudest comment he'd made in their acquaintance. He brought a letter from Crew's clerk. The territorial prosecutor had taken up the Kettle Creek case. Oris had retained counsel in Helena. The case was expected to proceed to full federal hearing in September. Garland had been formally charged on 3 counts, one of which carried a potential sentence of 5 years in territorial prison. There was a line at the bottom of the letter, added in Crew's own hand, that said simply, Miss Harper's testimony was the turning point. She should know that. Caleb read this to Eliza at the table that evening. She sat with her hands flat on the wood and listened without moving. When he finished, she said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Read that last line again." He did. She was quiet. She looked at the wall. Something moved in her throat. "Mrs. Caudell's the one who wrote it all down," she said finally. "I just carried it." "You carried it through 6 months of running," he said. "You recognized what it was when you read it. You brought it to the right person, and you stood in a courtroom and spoke to it out loud in front of the men who wanted to bury you." He looked at her. "That's not just carrying it." She pressed her mouth together. "All right," she said after a moment. "All right." He set the letter down. She pulled it toward her and read it herself, the way she always read things he'd already told her, not distrusting his reading, just wanting to receive the words directly, in her own time. He understood that about her now. She needed the primary source. She'd been given other people's versions of things too many times. In June, something shifted, not dramatically, not the way things shift in stories, with weather and music and a moment that announces itself. It shifted the way real things shift in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, while they were repairing the south fence line where the spring melt had pulled 2 posts loose from the ground. He was setting the post, and she was packing the dirt around the base of it, and they were talking about nothing, about whether the creek had gone down enough to ford, without getting the horses wet to the belly, about Pete's next visit, about the coffee supply that was getting low, and she stopped mid-sentence and said, "I used to think that people like me didn't get this." He looked up. "Happy," she said, like the word was strange in her mouth. "I used to think it was for other people. People who started with more. Who had families and names, and somebody to teach them they were worth it." She was still packing the dirt, her hands working steady. "I thought people like me got by, got through, maybe got comfortable if they were lucky. But not this. I was wrong," she said simply. He looked at her. She was looking at the fence post. Her hands were dirty and her hair was coming loose from the braid she'd put it in that morning, and she was wearing the old shirt she'd taken from his shelf in January and never given back. And she was the most complete thing he had ever seen. "Yes," he said, "you were." She looked up at him. Something in her face was open in a way that it hadn't been in December or January or even March. Open the way a room is open when someone has taken the boards off the windows and let the light back in. "Caleb," she said, "yeah, I love you. She said it without preamble and without the hesitation of someone unsure of the reception. She said it the way she made decisions after careful consideration, fully committed. I wanted to say it straight, because you always answer me straight, and I think you deserve the same. He'd stood there in the afternoon, with a fence post between his hands and the mountain at his back, and looked at Eliza Harper, who had been on an auction block 6 months ago, and thought about all the things he could say. Thought about how long it had been since those words had lived in his chest, and how differently they felt now than the last time he'd known them. And how love at 36 was not the same thing as love at 24. It was quieter and heavier and more intentional, chosen with the full knowledge of what it could cost. He set down the post. He crossed the 2 steps between them and put his hand against her jaw, and looked at her the direct way she had looked at him from the first day, taking her in fully, not looking away from anything. "I love you," he said. "I have for a while. I didn't say it because I was waiting to make sure you were saying yours for you and not for anything else." She looked at him. "And now you're sure, now I'm sure," he said. She stepped forward and put her forehead against his chest, and he put his arms around her. And they stood like that in the June afternoon beside a poorly repaired fence post, while Sutton grazed nearby and the creek ran, and the mountain held its ground around them. She was laughing a little, just barely. "That's very like you," she said into his shirt. Waiting to verify. "I'm a careful man," he said. "You're a careful, infuriating man," she said, and pulled back to look at him, and what was in her face was something he recognized as the real version of her, not the version that was managed and careful and waiting for the cost, but the one underneath all of that, the one that had survived everything and had found, against every odd, a place to land. He kissed her. She kissed him back, sure and present and entirely herself. And then they went back to fixing the fence, because the fence still needed fixing, and the mountain did not wait on sentiment. In July, Pete brought a letter from Eliza's stepbrother. She had not known she had a stepbrother. She had left home at 14 and never gone back, and never received word from anyone in that house in Missouri. The letter was short and addressed in the uncertain handwriting of someone who had not written many formal letters and had found the task difficult. It said that her father had died in the spring. It said that her stepmother was in poor health. It said with a particular awkward guilt of a man who has been told something by a dying parent that he doesn't know what to do with, that her father had asked, at the end, whether anyone knew where Eliza was. She read it twice, sat very still. Caleb watched her and didn't say anything. "He asked," she said finally. "Yes." "Not before," she said. "Not in 7 years of not writing." She looked at the letter. At the end, he waited. She folded the letter carefully. Set it on the table. "I don't know what I feel about that," she said. "I expected to feel more. I thought if I ever got news about my father I would feel something large. But it's just," she looked at her hands, "it's just sad. Like something that couldn't have been different being the thing it was." She paused. "That's all it is. Sometimes that's all it is," he said. He asked. She said again, quieter, "I suppose that means something." That at the end he asked. She looked out the window at nothing. "I'll write back. To the brother I'll tell him I'm well." She looked at Caleb. "That I'm well and where I am, and that he can write if he wants to." "That's generous," Caleb said. "It's not generous," she said. "I just don't want to carry anything else. I'm done carrying things that are too heavy to carry." She looked at him with a clarity that went all the way down. "I have enough worth carrying now." August came and the mountain was in its full summer. The high meadows green and the creek running clear, and the evenings long and slow and warm in the particular way that made you understand why people stayed in Montana, even when it tried to kill you 6 months out of the year. On a Sunday morning in August, Caleb brought the horses up from the lean-to, saddled them both, and said, "Come on." Eliza came to the door. "Where are we going, you'll see?" She looked at the horses, looked at him. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "You coming anyway?" She looked at him for a moment with that expression that was exasperation wearing the clothes of affection. Then she went for her boots. He took her up through the high trail on the north side of the mountain, the one that came out above the tree line onto a long open ridge where the whole world seemed to be below you, the valley, the river, the smear of Millerton in the distance. And beyond that, the plains running out to the horizon in every direction. Eliza stood at the edge of it and looked. She had not been up here before. He had not brought anyone up here since Clara, which he was thinking about and which he thought was appropriate, not painful in the way it had been, but tender, the way an old scar is tender. Healed but present, still part of the body. This is what you see from up here, she said. Most mornings, he said, when I checked the north line. And you never said anything about it. I was waiting to show you, he said. When it was time, she looked at the view for a long time. Then she looked at him. Is it time for something specific, she asked. Or just time in general? He reached into his coat pocket. He held out the $20 gold coin. She looked at it. Then at him. I've been thinking about what you said. When you gave it back. What? He paused. And I've been thinking about what I want it to mean going forward. Not what it was, what it is now, he held her gaze. I want to use it for something. Spend it on something that means more than what it cost. She looked at the coin in his palm. What did you have in mind? A ring, he said, if you'll have one, if that's something you want. He paused. I'm not asking because you owe me anything, or because you need a reason to stay. You've told me your reason and I believe you. He looked at her. I'm asking because I want the whole world to know you chose this. Chose me, that it was your decision made free and clear with nothing behind it but what you wanted. He paused. Because you have never in your life had anyone make that kind of public declaration about what you're worth to them. And you should have it. You should have had it a long time ago. Eliza stood on the ridge with the whole of Montana behind her and looked at Caleb Rourke, who had bought her freedom for $20 and spent the last 8 months proving that freedom was exactly what he meant. She reached out and took the coin from his hand. She held it for a moment. The weight of it, the warmth of it, the absolute improbable fact of standing here at all. Then she handed it back. Yes, she said, just that. Just yes. Said the way she said everything that mattered clearly, without decoration, with all of herself behind it. He closed his hand around the coin. He reached out with his other hand and she took it. They stood on the ridge in the August morning, while the world went on below them, being enormous and difficult and occasionally beautiful. And the horses grazed behind them. And the sky above Montana was the particular blue that you only got at elevation, deeper than ordinary sky, as if the color had more room to be itself up here. Pete found a jeweler in Helena. The ring came back with the October mail, a plain band of yellow gold that fit like it had been made for her hand. Which Pete claimed was because he'd used a length of twine as a guide, but which Eliza suspected was Pete having an eye for the kind of detail he pretended not to notice. She wore it every day. She was not sentimental about it in the way people expect women to be sentimental about rings. She wore it the way she wore the work gloves and the good boots as a practical item that told the truth about something. As a fact, by November, 1 year from the morning Caleb had come around the corner of Briggs Mercantile and seen a girl on a platform, the cabin had changed in ways that were all Eliza and none of them dramatic. A second shelf, a small rug by the door. The book she'd read twice, returned to the shelf and replaced on the table by a different one that Pete had brought because she'd asked him to look for it. Which meant that somewhere in Helena there was a bookseller who knew that a woman in the Bitterroot Mountains had opinions about what she wanted to read. She had also, that fall, begun keeping books for 2 neighboring claims whose owners had been cheated by poor accounting for years. She did this efficiently and without much fanfare, riding out twice a month with a ledger under her arm and coming back in the evenings with the particular satisfaction of a person using the thing they're best at for something that matters. Caleb watched her do all of it. He did not say much about it because there wasn't much that needed saying. He had known from the first week what she was, underneath all the things that had been done to her. He had just been waiting for her to have the room to show it. One evening in December, the first snow of the new winter coming down in the dark outside, they sat by the fire after supper and she looked at him and said, A year ago today. He looked up, thought about it. Give or take. Give or take, she said. She looked at the fire. I was on a platform in Birch Falls. Yes, he said. And you came around a corner, she said. Yes, and stepped forward, she said. Yes, she looked at him. The firelight moved on her face, on the ring, on everything that was hers in this room, which was hers as completely as anything had ever been anyone's. I've been thinking, she said, about what I would tell myself. If I could, that woman on the platform, she paused. I'd tell her to watch the crowd, to not look at Garland. To look at the edge of the crowd and wait, she paused again. Because there's a man coming around a corner, and he's going to step forward. And everything that comes after that is hard and strange, and better than anything you think you deserve. She looked at him steadily. I'd tell her to be ready. Caleb looked at her. What would she say back? Eliza considered. She'd say she's been ready her whole life, she said. She just didn't know what she was ready for. He looked at her for a long moment. At the woman who had been sold for $20 and had walked off a mountain auction platform into the hardest and best year of both their lives. At the woman who had carried evidence through 6 months of running and spoken truth in a federal courtroom and put her arms around him in a hotel hallway because something was finally over. At the woman who had given him a coin and taken a ring and called this cabin home before he'd thought to offer it. At Eliza. You were ready, he said. She smiled, the real one, the one that was entirely hers. So were you, she said. You just didn't know it yet, Heather. The snow came down outside, the fire held, the mountain rose above them, vast and dark and permanent, holding them the way it held everything, without preference, without sentiment. The same for everyone, and inside the cabin that had once been empty in the way that only one kind of loneliness can empty a place. 2 people sat together in the ordinary, extraordinary fact of having found each other at the exact moment the world tried its hardest to make sure they never would. The $20 coin sat on the shelf above the fireplace, where Caleb had put it the day the ring came. Not a debt paid, not a purchase made. A life chosen by 2 people who had each spent too long alone, chosen freely, chosen clearly, chosen with the full knowledge of what it cost and what it was worth. And what it was worth was everything.